Good evening. Can everybody find a place where they can see? I think we're a little beyond capacity, so I want to encourage you to embrace the spirit of peace and order and nonviolence, and in case any emergency does arise, everybody remain calm and don't trample each other, and we'll all be good. The fire department never needs to know about this. Okay. I'm Dr. Kelly Johnson. I'm a member of the Department of Religious Studies here at the University of Dayton, and I am very pleased on behalf of the groups who have sponsored the event for tonight, which are the Center of Social Concerns, the Departments of Religious Studies, Political Science, and Pax Christi, to be able to invite introduce our guest speaker for tonight. I want to invite you first, if you haven't already, to silence your technical gear, whatever it is, so that we can all be fully present here tonight. So it's my honor to introduce our speaker for this evening, Martha Hennessy. Ms. Hennessy is a mother, a grandmother, an occupational therapist, a peace activist, and a devout Catholic, which are a set of roles that many of us today have a hard time connecting. What does faith, which is so often seen as personal, irrational, escapist, comforting, have to do with the great crises of our time? Catastrophic climate change, drones, torture, racism, miserable poverty for 1 billion people, the long legacies of colonial injustice. That's a question, the relationship of faith to those crises, a question that Martha Hennessy knows very well, from the inside out. Ms. Hennessy, who is an activist and a thinker in her own right, happens also to be the granddaughter of the most famous U.S. Catholic activist of the 20th century, Dorothy Day, who, like a number of other activists, is much more popular now that she's not walking around upsetting people anymore. But Dorothy's particular charism, devout and intelligent faith, wed to a searching political analysis and unflinching commitment to the personal, direct action, is certainly not gone. The Catholic radical witness, led by the work of Dorothy Day, goes to the root of economic and political injustice to discover there the human longing for God. And as such, it continues to be desperately needed. So I'd ask you to join me in welcoming Ms. Hennessy to UD.
Thank you. I hear this is a very good turnout considering how long it took me to get here. I want to thank Brandon. I met Brandon perhaps 3 or 4 years ago. He came to Mary House. He took on the great task of trying to paint one of the stairways. And this is a very big old building, and we very much appreciate when young, strong volunteers come and do work that really desperately needs doing, and that paint job was really, really needed. So thank you, Brandon, for all that you've done and getting me here. And I also want to thank the students for the Center of Social Concerns and the Pax Christi group and all of you who worked really hard to get me here tonight. I know that it's not easy to open up a dialogue like this, and I think that it's something that's so desperately needed in our time. So I'm very grateful to have this platform. And Brandon has given me a tour of Dayton, and what a history, what a microcosm of so many different things that are good and not so good about our culture, our economy, our social concerns. And I do want to start with a prayer, and I chose, I don't know for what reason, but I chose this prayer from Rabbi Nachman of Breslau. God, I stand beaten and battered by the countless manifestations of my own inadequacies. Yet we must live with joy Aid me in this quest, O God. Help me find satisfaction and a deep, abiding pleasure in all that I have, in all that I do, and in all that I am. Amen. So I am one of 9 children. I grew up in Vermont. I was born in Staten Island on the Peter Marn farm, at that time the farm of the Catholic worker community. And my parents moved to Vermont when I was 2 years old, so I have very much grown up in a very rural setting, and I attended public school. My older siblings were educated in Catholic schools, but once we moved to Vermont, that was not possible. So I did grow up in a very, very rural neighborhood, very isolated, with a big house full of lots of books, and my mother always had her hands in all kinds of things. Back in the 1970s, she was making tofu and yogurt and those kinds of things. My husband said, "Your mother was a hippie." And so she gave us the good life on the land. We had gardens, we had animals, and I think that Tamara was very much a disciple of Peter Marn, with her devotion to the land and growing things. And so I'm very grateful for the childhood that I had out in the countryside with a big family. I've worked as an occupational therapist for about 25 years. I'm doing less and less of that. The more and more I get arrested, the less and less I'm able to function as a productive member of society. But I have worked with students in the public schools, and I've worked with the elderly, geriatric rehab, and I must say that that profession has been a real blessing. For me, that has brought the real issues of human suffering right before me. But I also experience, working with the children and working with the elderly, that each person who comes before me as a therapist has something to teach me, and I'm just very, very grateful to have had that. My husband of 34 years and I built a house right across the field from where I grew up, and we probably grow maybe 60% of our food. We have sheep, chickens, and grapevines and fruit trees that I planted 30 years ago, and that continuity and that connection to the land has very much sustained me, and it sustains me now in my work of being down in New York City. And so I am at Mary House. I go between my family in Vermont and Mary House. Everybody from both ends are constantly saying, "When is she coming back? When is she coming back?" And I try to come up with some kind of a sensible schedule, but it's very, very impossible. And so my life is very much unpredictable in terms of where I am when, but it's all good. So we have this title of A Revolution of the Heart, and I just want to quote for you Dorothy's writing of those words, and this does come from the book Loaves and Fishes, which came out, I believe, in 1963. The greatest challenge of the day is how to bring about a revolution of the heart, a revolution which has to start with each one of us. When we begin to take the lowest place, to wash the feet of others, to love our brothers with that burning love, that passion, which led to the cross, then we can truly say, "Now I have begun." And I would certainly encourage all of you to read Dorothy's words. She was a very, very gifted writer. So she has encouraged us to move forward in ways that I have spent my lifetime trying to figure out how that is done, even though I've had this example in front of me of both my mother and my grandmother, the way they lived their lives. And yet it's still a great challenge. You know, how do we become disciples of Jesus? How do we participate in that keen, keen suffering that comes with practicing the works of mercy, that comes with being a servant of others? And how do we convert to peace? How do we deal with the war that's in our own hearts. That certainly comes out within the context of family, friends, and community. And Dorothy showed us very beautifully this merging of faith with social justice, and it took me a very long time to understand that. I understood the component of social justice that resonated with me, but her piety and her religiosity, her faith, it took me a very long time to understand that that was the foundation, that that was the anchor for this standing up to the challenge of speaking truth to power at a cost. And certainly there's a personal struggle involved. Dorothy's experiences were not at all easy. Becoming a single working mother cost dearly. My mother was 7 when the movement was started, and they were separated, mother and daughter. They were very, very close. And the personal suffering that went on for both of them was quite apparent. I absorbed that sorrow and that grief as a child from both of them, as well as the joy and the beauty. Dorothy talked a lot about class struggle, and certainly with my tour of Dayton, there's so much evidence amongst us of this war that is going on with our class structure in the United States. And of course, we continue to struggle with how to keep belonging in the church. And I myself was out of the church for most of my adult life. I was very busy raising family and going to school and putting my kids through school. And I felt myself trapped between the power and the strength of Dorothy's conversion and the confusion of my mother leaving the church when my parents separated, when I was 6 years old. So how do we belong to the church? And the examples that we have had down through the ages of the church collaborating with state interests certainly has been discouraging for me to study as an adult. And yet the church is our mother. The church is our mother, and we belong with her, and we need to reclaim her. Also in my work, I find that I'm struggling with this question of the knowledge and the truth of God when that comes to a point of clashing with the rule of law. And I'll talk more about that in terms of my involvement with, I don't like to use the terms activist or resistive work. And Dorothy never referred to herself as an activist. And I don't know what a good word would be to describe what we do, but to really address the rule of law when it brings us injustice, and when we're up against this structure, knowing that it is flawed, we find ourselves very much relying on the scriptural writings to give us support and courage and clarity on how to move forward. I would like to read to you the preface to the Loaves and Fishes. This gives a bit of a description in Dorothy's own words, trying to explain herself, trying to explain the Catholic worker community to others. And she's such a fabulous writer. This book is the story of the Catholic worker, a story I only touched on in my autobiography, The Long Loneliness, in 1951, published some years ago. What is the Catholic worker? First of all, it is an 8-page monthly tabloid paper, of which you can pick up copies here. The writing in it concerns work and men and problems of poverty and destitution, and man's relationship to his brothers and to God. In trying to show our love for our brothers, we talk and write a great deal about the works of mercy as the most direct form of action. Quote, direct action is a slogan of old-time radicals. In the 30s, it meant bringing ideas to the man in the street via picketing and leaflets, storming employment offices, marching on Washington, Today, in the peace movement, direct action means boarding Polaris submarines, walking to Moscow, and sailing boats like the Everyman into areas where nuclear testing is going on. What kind of an organization do we have? It's hard to answer that. We don't have any in the usual sense of the word. Certainly we are not a cooperative, not a settlement house, and not a mission. We cannot be said to operate on a democratic basis. Once, both an ex-soldier and an ex-Trappist were staying with us, and I asked each in turn how he liked the Catholic worker group. The soldier said, "It's just like the army." And the Trappist said, "It's like a Trappist monastery." Then a man from an Israeli kibbutz visited us, and I asked him the same question. He felt very much at home, he said, because the atmosphere was that of the kibbutzim. A visitor from India likened our city house of hospitality to an ashram. A teacher of Russian at Fordham told us our farming commune reminded her of Tolstoy's house, his home. Someone else called it a benevolent dictatorship. Perhaps the most accurate description was supplied by the friend who referred to it as a, quote, revolutionary headquarters. So sometimes she does have poetic license and really embroiders on things, but she's very clear in bringing forth a great creative involvement and engagement. She very much was a person who engaged people and clearly understood their attributes and their weaknesses, and certainly was willing to speak clearly and honestly about those, and her own, as you can see in her diaries, which was published in 2008. She's constantly reprimanding herself and her failures in each day. So as a child, she came to our home in Vermont and visited us fairly frequently, as much as she could. And she was very much an integral part of my life. And she was a regular granny. She had a distinct presence to her, for certain. She was very tall, she was very big. And she would come and be a regular grandmother to us. And we understood very early on that there was something about her that did not belong to us, that belonged to the world. And so that was an interesting walk that we walked with her in terms of her being a family member, but also being much, much greater than that. But we would drive her crazy with our childhood behaviors, and you can imagine 9 of us really being out of control, living in a big farmhouse in Vermont. And now, I have to say, well, let me tell you, besides the visits of her coming to Vermont, we also started to spend our summers at the Tivoli farm. The Catholic worker always tries to have, as well as the house of hospitality, a place out in the country, a farm, ideally where people get to learn how to work and create crops and bring food into the city to help contribute to the soup kitchen and to the cooking of the meals for the homeless. And so as a teenager, I spent a lot of time at the Tivoli farm in the late 60s, early 70s, and you can imagine that there was so much going on in those times, what with the Vietnam War and Dorothy's supporting of conscientious objector status for people who did not want to participate in that. And during that time, when I was 14, my brother, who was 20, was drafted into the army and fought in Vietnam. And Dorothy did speak to him about considering conscientious objector status, and he simply said no. And she very much respected the primacy of conscience for each and every one of us, and the free will to choose and to figure out our own paths. And so those were very, very tumultuous times for us at Tivoli Farm, and also we would go down into New York City and participate in the marches that were happening at that time. And so now I spend half of my time at Mary House, going back and forth between my family, and we offer meals to homeless women. We have St. Joe's House on 1st Street and Mary House on 3rd Street. We offer meals to perhaps 50 to 75 women 4 days a week. We also have access to showers, access to a clothing room, and access to telephone use. And so I take house shifts, and the job is to cook a very big meal for, at least 50 people. And being a mother and a wife, that has certainly come in handy to transition this role into Catholic worker life. We also participate in Bible study. We have what are called Friday night meetings, clarification of thought, Peter Morin's roundtable discussions, and we have a variety of guests who come. And we also have a pool of priests who are willing to come to our crazy, chaotic houses and give us Mass. Tuesdays at St. Joseph's and Thursdays at Mary House. We have Bible study 1 day a week, and so we try to keep that life of worker and scholar going within our community of the Catholic worker. And the house that we're in, Mary House, used to be a music school, and so it's a very old building, and it was purchased in the mid-70s. And I was last in Mary House in 1980 for my grandmother's funeral, and I had not set foot in Mary House until 2004. I was very busy in Vermont raising family and not being in the church and just trying to enjoy a peaceful life. And the specter of trying to stand up in public and to speak about Dorothy, I spent 25 years avoiding that. That was not something that anyone in my family was interested or feeling capable of engaging in. And so I was away from Mary House for many years, and the neighborhood has changed significantly. When I was a kid, when we visited there, St. Joe's was purchased in the mid-'60s. It was a very bombed out neighborhood, very, very impoverished, and now it's NYU and $3,000 to $5,000 a month rent, and it's very different. We often ask ourselves, are we still in the right location? We need to have more dialogue about that. And probably the footprint of Mary House as a tear down would be worth at least $10 million. And we need to really look at who are we serving, where are the poor, what are we accomplishing? And then, of course, there's a lot of attachment to the building because that's where Dorothy lived and died. And also, is it important to remain as a witness in an affluent neighborhood, the Empire State, Lower Manhattan being very much the epicenter of empire? So I would like to walk you through a little bit of a history, and I'll try and be brief with this, looking at each decade of Dorothy's life. Her story is an incredible story, a very beautiful story, a very sorrowful story. And yet it's absolutely embedded in our history of the United States. She was very much a product of America. And she was born in 1897, and as a child, living in Brooklyn, she very much enjoyed the nature, the world of natural, looking at the rivers, looking at the marshes around where she lived in Brooklyn, and I'm sure at the turn of the century, it's a very, very different environment than what it is now. And when she was a child, around 8 years old, her family moved to San Francisco, and she experienced the San Francisco earthquake in 1906. And that really branded in her mind and in her heart what it looks like when catastrophe hits and when people come together and start taking care of each other. Her mother just gave away everything in the house to people in desperate need. And it was there that she really felt the presence of God, heaven on earth, in that catastrophic moment. And then they moved to Chicago. They lived in poor neighborhoods. She talks a lot about being in the back of the yards and walking the neighborhoods and really seeing extreme poverty, being aware of extreme poverty as a young girl. She attended the University of Illinois in 1914 at the age of 16, and then at the age of 19, her family moved to New York. She dropped out of college. She had too many other things to get on to. I don't mean to drop any hints here. But she found work in New York. Her father was a journalist. She is initially and first and foremost a journalist, a very gifted writer. And her father was a journalist, as were her two older brothers. And she found work in New York despite her father going to the people that she was interviewing with and asking them not to hire her because he did not think that journalism was a vocation for women. And so she worked as a writer. She cut her teeth on all the social issues of the time, labor issues. She worked for the Call, the Masses, and the Liberator, all very much socialist, communist papers of the time. And in the 1920s, she lived a very bohemian life. She was associating with all kinds of literary figures at that time. The 1920s is when she very much suffered as a young woman trying to figure out her vocation and how she was to live her life personally. A lot of trauma in those times. It was the decade that she experienced her first arrests. She met my grandfather. She conceived and gave birth to my mother, Tamar, and she was baptized in 1927. The 1930s, she very much struggled. Before the Catholic worker movement started, which was in 1933, she was still struggling as a journalist, trying to support herself and her child. She left my grandfather. They separated when my mother was 2 or 3. And there was great disorder around her. It was the time of the Great Depression, the time of the Dust Bowl, ecological disaster, the displacement of many, many people, internal migrations that were massive, moving people off the land and into the cities and into factory work. And so she was observing and writing about all of this. And of course, in 1932, she went to the DC Hunger March to report on that, and that was where she went to the shrine and prayed for God to combine her Catholic faith with her social justice awareness. And then when she got home, she met Peter Maurin, and the rest, of course, is history. And the first issue of the paper came out May 1st, 1933, and it's still a penny a copy. And the Catholic worker movement at that point in the 1930s was involved with feeding the striking seamen. That's how the soup kitchen started, was by feeding the workers who were out of work. And they also picketed the Bremen, which was a German warship that came into New York Harbor. Dorothy was very aware of what was brewing in Europe at that time. She opposed the Spanish Civil War, and that cost her greatly in many ways. Many of the Catholics were supporting Franco, and that was a great, great struggle for her. She published the book Houses of Hospitality in 1936. From Union Square to Rome came out in 1938, and they acquired their first farm in Easton, Pennsylvania in 1938, and that's where my mother got out of the city. My mother was not happy being a city person, and she was able to experience the country for the first time. She has great memories about that. The 1940s, of course, the movement was growing by leaps and bounds. Many houses of hospitality were opening, and she was doing a lot of work speaking around the country. She also witnessed the dropping, or living in the time of the dropping of the atomic bomb in World War II, and she wrote about this in the paper in September of 1945, and I have to read just a little segment of this to you, very, very powerful. Mr. Truman was jubilant. We have killed 318,000 Japanese. That is, we hope we have killed them, writes the Associated Press on page 1, column 1 of the Herald Tribune. The effect is hoped for, not known. It is to be hoped that they are vaporized, our Japanese brothers, scattered men, women, and babies to the 4 winds, over the 7 seas. Perhaps we will breathe their dust into our nostrils, feel them in the fog of New York in our faces, feel them in the rain on the hills of Easton. For me, this reading very much speaks to her understanding of the mystical body of Christ. How we are all one, how we are all brothers and sisters, and what affects part of the body affects the entire body. And with her stance on opposing World War II, she did not feel that any war was just, and most especially with the opening of the atomic era, that there was no way to wage survivable war with nuclear weapons. And so half of the houses closed during World War II, and the circulation of the paper shrank phenomenally. And in the 1940s was also the decade my mother married in 1944, and Peter Marn died in 1949. And Tamar very much remembers listening to Peter talk and talk and talk. And the 1950s was the McCarthy era, the Cold War, the Korean War. Dorothy was followed and scrutinized by the FBI. There was a dossier on her, which was in later years brought out and read to her, and she made comments like, "Oh, they make me sound like a mean old woman." And The Long Loneliness came out in 1951. During the 1950s, starting in 55, the year that I was born, June of 55, up through 1961, they practiced protesting of the air raid drills. New York City, everyone was told to duck and cover, and she understood that this was a psychological war. She understood that it was not survivable, and she refused to go into the fallout shelters. And I think that first year there was a handful of people. And until 1961, it grew each year. And she went to jail each year, anywhere from, I think, 2 weeks to 30 days. And finally, the air raid drills were called off in 1961. The 1960s, she visits Cuba, she travels to Rome, she participates in the Vatican II Council, she condemns the Vietnam War and again receives a lot of flack for that. She had correspondence at that time with Thomas Merton, and she supported the first draft card burners at that time. And she had a great concern for the young people in the 1960s. This was a time of sexual liberation. The birth control pill came out, and she was very, very concerned for the health of the young people growing up in this decade of war and confusion and great efforts at liberation, and also the witnessing of these great leaders, Martin Luther King Jr. and JFK, and the question of these people being murdered at the hands of the state. The 1970s, she had her last arrest in 1973, and that was concerning the plight of the migrant workers, the grape workers out in California, supported Cesar Chavez. She received the Latari Medal from Notre Dame. She was not allowed to speak at Notre Dame in the 1940s. But by 1970, they were ready to give her a medal. She did her best to avoid receiving any of the honorariums from universities and colleges that participated in ROTC. But apparently with this medal, the story goes that she was away when the message came and she didn't have time enough to refuse accepting it, something like that. And of course, Mary House opened in the mid-70s. She traveled to Africa, India, Tanzania. She visited Mother Teresa's community in India. She had her first heart attacks in 1976, and that very much slowed her down. She received an 80th birthday greeting from Pope Paul VI. Mother Teresa visited her at Mary House in 1979, and she died November 29th in 1980. And she died at Mary House with my mother by her side. It was the first Sunday of Advent that she died. So that just gives you a little bit of a history of what was happening, and I'm only touching upon some of the highlights that really appeal to me, but if you study her, you can hear about so many other issues and concerns of the day in each of those decades that the Catholic Worker paper, the paper as the organ of the movement, tried to talk about and address. I do feel it's important to give you a little bit of the Catholic Worker philosophy, some of the important tenets that most of the communities, we have perhaps 200 communities around the country and around the world now, and it's a loosely held kind of thing. There's no head person saying who can be calling themselves a Catholic worker and who can't, but we do have these basic tenets. But this Catholic practice is not separate. This lay movement is not separate from radical political thought. Peter Marn presented her with the Catholic social teachings. He talked about the Catholic social teachings being the dynamite in a box that the church is sitting on the lid of. And it was the Catholic workers' job to blow that lid and to bring out the Catholic social teachings. And he proposed a very simple program of action, as we read earlier, direct action, based on the Catholic social teachings, the dignity of work, the questioning of modern warfare ever being just or feasible. And the point is we must put our hands to the work. There's plenty of work to be done. There really should not be any time to despair. There should not be unemployment. Unemployment is part of that capitalist arrangement of controlling people and their work and exploiting people's labor. And so the Catholic worker got to work taking care of the poor immediately, and the personalism of responding and not waiting for someone else, not waiting for government to take care of who is right at your doorstep. And to live in precarity, the Catholic worker runs by donations only. And very early on, she did a lot of begging, and in the 30s, there was a point where they weren't sure that they were able to continue paying the rents and getting the paper out. So this business of living in precarity and trusting in God very much puts us in a position of humility and love. So the three tenets that I want to leave you with about the Catholic worker philosophy, and I don't know if any of the other anarchistic people would agree with me that I hit the nail on the head with these three basic tenets, but I'll do my best with them. And the first one, of course, is hospitality and personalism. We are called to do the corporal works of mercy as very ordinary acts and as gifts. You know, this direct action is a gift to taking care of the person in front of you who needs care. And it's not about changing that person, it's about changing ourselves. The revolution of the heart is something that we're not saying that this person has to become better because of our efforts. We are saying that there is a mutual exchange there that occurs. The presence of Christ comes through these works. You know, to take responsibility, to do the work that's at hand as a means of confronting evil and also as a means of subverting the capitalist system that doesn't tell us that we are our brother's keeper and that we do need to take care of the more vulnerable in our families and society. The second tenet that I would mention is, of course, is voluntary poverty. And that very clearly and consistently runs against our grain as Americans. We are raised to believe that we are to succeed, to climb the ladder of success. The more money we make, the more material well-being we have. That's what we're judged by. And so, if we race to the bottom, if we say we're not participating in this, we are not consuming so many goods, we are not consuming so much energy, that's a very subversive act. Open your mouth and I will fill it, says the Lord in the Psalms. And Dorothy writes, the more you give away, the more the Lord will give you to give. And she also spoke about the use of poor means to try and do what you can. Having grown up, survived the Great Depression, a lot of people really understood the need to conserve and to not consume. And of course, by poor means, she means very simply getting by with very little, making do with what you have at hand and not thinking that you can't move forward without something better. And of course, the third tenet being nonviolence and pacifism. This requires great courage to speak truth, especially when you're in the minority, and also especially to be practicing pacifism and trying to bring daily kindness to situations when you're facing violence. I often think in terms of nonviolence and pacifism, what brings to my mind in terms of the scriptural readings is Jesus in the garden, the agony in the garden where he is struggling, the human part of him is struggling to accept what's being asked of him. And I think with our work at the Catholic Worker, it's a daily struggle. It's a daily struggle for me to quell my internal imperial urgings. Being an occupational therapist and being a Martha, which Dorothy certainly put her finger on that with my sister Mary and I. She gave me a little story when I was 16 that I'll never forget about being a Martha. It's very hard for me to go with the chaos of a community like the Catholic Worker and to retain that peacefulness in one's own heart. And Dorothy struggled with trying to maintain a contemplative life, being in the heart of New York City, being in the heart of a very busy community. How do you retain that peaceful stance? And of course she was always faced with the question of being passive versus being a pacifist, and that's a whole other discussion to be had. But while touching upon nonviolence and pacifism, I do want to quote Pope Francis. This was something he wrote in February 2014. And we can't thank God enough for sending us Pope Francis. War is a scandal to be mourned every day. Today, millions kill their own brothers, and we are used to it. The spirit of war, which draws us away from God, doesn't just reside in distant parts of the world. The spirit of war comes from our own hearts. This is what Christians should do today in the face of war. We should weep, we should mourn, and of course we have the Beatitudes that tell us, "Blessed are they who mourn, for they shall be comforted." And of course this brings us to the spiritual works of mercy. And I just want to share with you a few points. We do want to have question and answer, a very important part of giving these talks. Peter Marn would hog the stage for maybe 20 minutes, and then someone would have to elbow him out of the way and say, okay, it's time for roundtable discussion and opening things up. So I really do want you to participate in that. But I'll just say that for us today, our cross to bear, in my mind, today is the U.S. military, and the war machine, and our national security state. And Dorothy certainly talked about we are all guilty of each other's sins. And so we are not exonerated. We are complicit in what is going on in the world today. And I have had the opportunity to travel to Afghanistan, to travel to the Rafah border. I tried twice to get into Gaza, not successfully. I've had 2 visits to Israel-Palestine. I've seen the wall. And Jesus has told us to love our enemy. I have gone on these trips in order to meet the enemy and to love the enemy. In Afghanistan, we stayed with a community of different young men from different ethnic groups, Hazara, Pashtun, Tajik, and others. And what I learned there was that the enemy is actually ourselves, other families struggling to survive, struggling to feed their children, trying to educate their children. And I think probably the greatest way of breaking down this mythology of who is the enemy is to go and visit. You know, any country that we're at war with, go and visit. It's a dangerous proposition. It's a scary proposition. We had to be very careful in Kabul, but my time there, I never felt so close to God with these Muslim friends of mine. And I just don't want us to forget. I'm here to remind you of the suffering that is going on at the hands of the U.S. military. And this is so that we can have the highest standard of living ever in human history. The 2 other things that I've been involved with is an organization called Witness Against Torture, this business of Guantanamo Bay prison camp. Right now, there are still prisoners on hunger strike. They have been cleared for release. and they are not being released. And there are different reasons for all of that, which I don't want to get into here. But they are being kept in indefinite detention, and a lot of them have lost hope and are now on hunger strikes. So we would spend our time fasting, vigiling, and processing with black hoods over our heads. I find myself in some pretty crazy places following this work of God. But in solidarity with these prisoners, we would do fasts anywhere from 6 to 12 days. We've been arrested since 2007 at the Department of Justice, the District Court, Supreme Court, Congressional Building. We just have brought our grievances and our petitions to our government over and over and over again, and there is very much a wall of silence there, impenetrable. And of course, the other thing that I've been involved with is the business of drones, unmanned aerial vehicles. And I do have a hearing in November to go before the judge. The charges are criminal contempt. They are threatening us with 1 year in prison, and they have been using orders of protection, which are typically used in situations of domestic violence and battering of mothers and wives. And there's a lot of pressure coming down to bear on these local judges to put a stop to this challenge to Hancock Air Base in Syracuse, New York. And the whole business of drones as the next way of making war is an entirely different threshold that we're crossing over, similar to the threshold of the atomic bomb. And so this is what I'm spending my time doing. I also, as part of the Spiritual Works of Mercy, have to give a little bit of admonishment to the University of Dayton, the top-tier Catholic Research Institute. I read a little bit about Innovation Summit. I understand that there's an $82 billion business in the drone industry, and of course a lot of resources, a lot of research effort, a lot of focus is being put in the direction of the war machine. And of course, we're always compartmentalizing, saying this is only one component of a greater picture. We're not necessarily participating in the literal killing of other people's children, and yet that is the end product of this industry. So we can retool, we can convert to peacetime. It's going to take a lot of effort on our parts individually. And I do have a booklet that I grew up with. My father was a bookseller, and he had this booklet called, the title of it was, Who Baptized Capitalism? And I think it was put out by the Blackfriars of England, and I need to study that little booklet a bit more. But Peter Morin did talk about trying to announce and not simply just to denounce. So I do apologize for bringing maybe more bad news than I should be bringing good news, gospel news. But let us end with this prayer, and then we'll open up for question and answer. Come, Holy Spirit, take possession of our hearts, and enkindle therein the fire of your divine love. Send forth your Spirit, and we will be created, and you will renew the face of the earth. O God, who by the light of the Holy Spirit instructs the hearts of the faithful, grant by that same Holy Spirit a right understanding of things, a love and relish for what is right and just, and the enjoyment of your presence with us always. We ask this through Christ our Lord. Amen. Thank you. I'm half deaf, so you really should shout out your questions. This is the good part, not listening to me lecture, but asking your questions. Yes?
I wanted to just ask you, in terms of your consideration of Dorothy Day's prophet, and if you could comment on perhaps the futility of prophecy.
She's a 20th century prophet. What do we do with our prophets? We kill them. And we hide our sins. And I think for Dorothy, it was a question of prophesizing in the heart of empire, and doing it in a gentle way, and doing it in a simple way, and a straightforward way, doing it as a woman, doing it as a mother, experiencing life to its fullest, and yet being willing to offer, her talents and her abilities to this, what looked like a hopeless cause. They called themselves fools for Christ, facing daily failure. But her words, and she was so prolific in her writing, a lot of her speeches are recorded, and so there's just a treasure trove of her words and her work that just speak absolutely. Just this reading about the bombing of Japan, to me, that is just such a prophetic witness to both the atomic era and to the horrors of the capitalist system, the wreckage, the human wreckage that's created with our economic system. And she was willing to speak to that over and over again, at great personal cost and at cost to the movement as well. But she always talked about the movement will continue if God wants it to, and that gave her strength and courage to just simply say what needed to be said. Thank you. Yes?
What would you say is the biggest barrier to the average person living a life of ethical and social justice?
What is the biggest barrier? Your career, your education. I spent my adulthood taking care of my children, working as an OT, paying war taxes. I think for students today, the biggest barrier will be the debt that they incur when they come out of school. And, there are so many barriers, economic, family. Who wants their children joining a movement like this and giving up a good education and giving up security and going to prison? A conversion is a very mysterious thing. We don't know what moves us, when the Holy Spirit will move us to make us feel capable of taking a step or taking a risk in getting more involved. But Dorothy also talked about every little effort matters. You cast your pebble into the pond and you don't know where the ripples may go. And each and every one of us has to come to a point of taking courage. I was a complete coward. All I wanted to do was stay home. And stepping out, pushing yourself further is something that we're not really used to doing, especially with the implications of what happens to you when you speak truth that's not popular. But the importance is that you are the witness, not how you succeed, not what the effort, not what the results of your effort are, but the fact that you actually even tried, that you raised a voice against severe injustice, that you said no. So I would encourage all of us to just look at our lives and how we can actually say something, do something that tries to open up other people's hearts. And I know that it's hard, especially when our economy is so controlled in terms of this permanent warfare. But I don't want to encourage people to drop out of school. But yes, wherever the hands are, I can't see. Okay.
I have two things, but first I want to say, as an engineering student where most of that drug research goes on, I applaud you for calling us out on it. I don't think there's enough people at the school that are willing to actually put their money where their mouth is in terms of our Catholic and Marianist identity. So thank you.
Sure. Yeah. Hey, it's easy enough for me. I'm leaving town tomorrow morning.
But I was wondering, you mentioned how the Catholic social justice is like the dynamite box the church sits on, and I was wondering if you had any suggestions or any comments on how we can like generate passion in our own lives to help blow the lid off things?
Well, let's start quoting Pope Francis. He's speaking very loud and clear in the Catholic worker tradition, in the Catholic social teaching tradition, and even citing some of the other encyclicals. It's very clear what was said during World War I. I mean, we're in the 100th anniversary of World War I. We have been practicing war for 100 years. Are we Catholics or are we Americans? That's the other big question and challenge. Dorothy was told all the time that she was a communist and that she should just leave and go to Russia. But her friend said, "You're not a communist. You believe in God too much. You talk about God too much. You're not a communist." But to bring back to life those teachings, let's study them. Let's teach them. Let's talk more about them, because that is something that the priests certainly aren't bringing. There are some, of course, bringing that to the laity, but there's that huge risk of, if you're going to walk this path, where does it lead to? It leads to living in more poverty. And so the more we can study the Catholic social teachings, the better off we'll be, the better Catholics will be. And there's some amazing readings to be had, especially with the onset of modern warfare. The World War I represented the first aerial bombardment, and that's in the profession of occupational therapy. Our roots came out of World War I with this business of shell shock. That was the first showings of post-traumatic stress because of this bombardment. It was just something so heinous to the human psyche. So if we can just keep studying and keep speaking out as best we can. Yes?
When you were talking about some of the struggles with your ministry in New York City, there seemed, or I perceived that there was a difference in the sense of belonging for an urban dweller than a rural dweller to the land. And I was just curious whether or not I conducted that perception, or if that perception actually exists.
The difference between urban and rural.
In the sense of belonging to the
Yeah. Oh, Lower Manhattan nearly killed me after 50 years in Vermont. The whole sensory experience of going from one setting to the other is very overwhelming. And I think, once again, if we can focus on respecting and meeting individual needs, some folks do better out in the countryside, some folks do better in the city, and I think the beauty of the Catholic worker model is that you can have that choice. If you can get it together. Buying land certainly is expensive these days, but if you can have that option. And also the purpose of the balance of the rural and urban settings was, for Peter, he talked about scholars getting out of the city and being workers and getting their hands dirty, become manual laborers. And also for workers to become scholars by coming into the city and studying and participating in roundtable discussions. And so I think it's nice to have a balance of both. But nowadays there are very few people who can make life work on the land. It's not an easy thing, raising your own food. It's a lot of work. My son is constantly asking, "You're doing all that work for a few cabbages?" But in the end, it's amazing how prolific and abundant, living on the land really is. But it's a skill that's very much being lost, especially in the age of technology. Yes?
What does living simply mean when you have children?
Whoa. What does living simply mean when the kids are squawking for the first, best, newest everything? Well, I grew up in poverty. My family didn't have any choice. My mother tried to work as a nurse, very minimum, $2 an hour, I think, as an LPN back in the 60s. I think if you disconnect from TV and internet, that gives you a better chance. As an occupational therapist, I'm asking the question is, what is happening to the evolution of our brains and our hands in terms of what we're engaging in now with that screen in front of us? I think, food, clothing, and shelter. How do we get back to the simplicity of food, clothing, and shelter? And everything is so mechanized. Everything is mass-produced. You're not taught or told that making your own is something that's good to do. But I know that kids very much love engaging in hands-on things. And so there is a movement in Vermont. A lot of people are homeschooling their kids. And then they sort of come into community. All of this has to be done within the context of community. I mean, this going to prison has to be done within a group. So there are parents who are sharing, the responsibility of raising kids on less, raising kids without this concept of having to have more and more and more. And I see the gamut just amongst my own grandchildren in terms of, I have 3 children and a 7th grandchild on the way. And there's a huge difference between how they're being raised with that question of living more simply. But children are very, very instinctive and very intuitive, and they know what feels right if they're given the chance to see something that's different than being competitive and materialistic. Yes. Way in the back.
Elaborate a little bit more on the role that your own faith has played in your work of advocacy.
Can you repeat that?
Yeah, could you elaborate a little bit more on the role that your own personal faith has played in your work of advocacy?
I was really comfortable in Vermont with my family. And then I sort of got pushed out the door. And it's not easy understanding my own conversion and pilgrimage. And I think we're often left with trying to listen very carefully to the voice of God. And what does that mean? Is this my will or is this God's will? And I struggle with that on a daily basis. I have all kinds of things that I want to accomplish or achieve. And I think the more that we can walk with humility, the more that we can try and wait on God. In my experience of finally stepping out into the world, well, in 2002, Dorothy was inducted into the National Women's Hall of Fame, and my family was approached to try and give some kind of to show up to receive the award in the first place, which my mother was certainly not going to do. And it was at that point in time that I really gained a sense of the importance of this work, and that, like it or not, comfort level or not, I had to approach this. And, as a teenager, I couldn't relate to that faith-based. And now, as I'm doing the work, I understand I cannot take the handcuffs, receive the handcuffs. I cannot do the 12-day fast without my community and the prayer life to support it. And it was in 2004 that I really started hearing more. The seeds that my grandmother planted really took a long time to germinate, I have to say. And it was in 2004 that all of this business of the images of Abu Ghraib were one of the things that absolutely stunned me as an occupational therapist. And I just found myself praying, and things just I went deeper and deeper from that point on. It's not an easy thing to explain, these conversions, and they're ongoing. And it will manifest itself in different ways the further on we go with it. Thank you. Any other questions?
What about, there's so many different issues out there. A lot of times find it kind of overwhelming to think
Yes.
about everything and just almost feel maybe like frozen. Where do you even start? Or, you know, how do you, and all the little things here and there, but do you have any advice on the starting point?
How do you overcome the paralysis and the fear? Dorothy wrote about fear being such a dangerous thing. And there are a lot of issues, but if you can think in terms of connecting the issues as one big issue, the human dignity, where is our humanity and where is our, dignified treatment of each other? And certainly war and torture and drone use. Those are all the littler issues. And I think I sort of landed on the two issues of Guantanamo and the drones simply because those were the issues that my community at that time felt that they could take on. There were a group of people who actually traveled to Cuba to try and visit the prisoners as part of the Works of Mercy, visiting the prisoner. And I think if you start local, if you start small, what's the big issue here? The big issue that could be looked at and addressed is the economics of the money from Department of Defense coming into the educational system. If you're students and teachers, perhaps that's a place to start in terms of raising a voice, questioning, and just having dialogue. Remember, we live in a democracy. Supposedly, we live in a democracy. And whatever we can do to bring that dialogue back. Things are so polarized. And, we're not being brought out back and shot yet. But we really, and I have sat with people in Egypt, and they said, you need to go back to your country because that's where all of this is coming from. We can't speak here. We will be killed. And so let's take advantage, let's appreciate the fact that we can speak out still in certain ways. And take courage from each other also. But I think finding one key issue that affects the most people is certainly a good start. Thanks. Yes?
I have a little struggle with we live in a global world.
Yeah.
And many of students are going out into the world, out there, doing wonderful things. Doing wonderful things. And it's encouraged. Go out there, get an experience of do a what they call it, a foreign study.
Sure.
And yet, here in the local space, I know it is a both and kind of thing. I want to be, but it seems to me that's become very popular to do as well. So our service overseas or our service down south or wherever it might be, and we do ignore the issues at home.
Yes.
So again, how do we? And I know the answer to that question, but it's how do you wrestle with that? How do you encourage people to center into the place where they're at and become knowledgeable and experts in those areas? Because many of these issues are geographically centered.
Well, if you set the bar too high to become an expert, that's pretty discouraging. Trying to keep it simple. I know that we have these missions to Africa. Well, what about the west side of Dayton? And also, our work with Guantanamo, we're often told, well, what about the prison system here in the United States, the torture that goes on? And these are very good questions. How do you get more local? How do you commit yourselves? How do you overcome the local barriers? I'm guilty of it myself, flying off to Kabul, Afghanistan. sometimes is so much easier to try and grasp more of what's happening globally. And we have to just maintain our humility and maintain our simplicity in certain ways. And another important term of the Catholic worker movement is personalism. How do we relate to those around us? We're all caught up in this system. We lose sense and we lose track of each other as individuals. And I have to remind myself constantly that it's not this particular judge in front of me that I'm angry with. It's the system of what's happening. And if we can remind ourselves over and over again, we're confronting a system, we're not confronting the people who are caught in the system. And it takes courage to face your own neighbors. It takes courage to face those who are you're closest to.
A little more practical of a question. Like how, whenever I think of how I would like to maybe like do a protest and risk the possibility of getting arrested, things go back to like how would we pay our bills or
Right.
things like that. If it's not so much that, like how do you not lose your farm, or how do you not lose your land?
My husband's at home paying the bills. I'm not. He's asking me that same question. I think living in community where you can have that shared burden. I mean, I raised my kids. I wasn't going to go getting arrested. Actually, I did. My first arrest was in 1979, and my son was 2 years old, and that was very, very painful regarding nuclear power. And so you can only do what you can do in the time frame. And again, waiting on God, waiting on God's time is part of that. But if you live on very little, if you live in shared community, that frees you up to do a lot. And you're not the one stuck paying the car payments. And, as long as you can simplify and reduce your own cost of living, it's very seductive getting caught up into this debt economy and living on credit. And it's the modern day form of slavery, and you get yourselves buried in debt, and no way are you available to protest having gotten there in the first place. So I can't say that I'm being fair in how I'm approaching this. And I think we're all called to do different things in different ways, and that's the best that we can do at the time. And there are different phases of life where you're able to do different things. And when you have young children, and here Dorothy started this movement when my mother was 7 years old, and she was called a bad mother. But what if she didn't do what she did? What if she didn't listen to that voice of God? And so as long as we think that we're doing God's will and not just simply our own will, pathways, doors will open. Doors have certainly opened for myself to do the work. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Martha. This is just a reminder, you guys, as you're going out, there are copies of the Catholic Worker newspaper and some other literature from the Worker that Martha has brought to share with us. So pick those up on your way out. Contribute a penny if you want.